If everybody would have a seat, we'll continue on with the panel discussion. Let me introduce our panelists for you. First of all, Bill Eliopoulos. Bill is one of my partners at Rutan Tucker. He's co-chair of Rutan's construction group and managing partner of our Silicon Valley office. Bill's a 1981 graduate of the University of California at Davis Law School, and he has more than 30 years of experience in construction law, including claims and negotiation and drafting of a wide array of different kinds of complex construction contracts, which would, of course, include traditional design-build contracts, integrated project delivery, lean construction, and creative financing models such as public-private partnerships. Bill's experience covers virtually all types of construction projects, and he has recently co-authored articles on the P3 project delivery method, which were published in the Design-Build Institute of America's Integration Magazine and the California State Bar Association's Real Property Section Quarterly. So Bill's going to serve as our moderator. Bill, if you would join us up here on the podium. Please hold your applause. Next, I'll introduce Tony Harris. Tony is a licensed professional engineer and is the principal of Creative Infrastructure Solutions. Tony was formerly the Chief Deputy Director for the California Department of Transportation, where he managed the daily multimodal operations of what is, of course, the largest transportation department in the country. Tony also served as the Interim Director of Caltrans and led the department through 3 transportation programming cycles, including both periods of significant growth and periods of reduction. Tony worked on such important transportation projects as the I-5 widening and Route 91 toll road in Orange County, where I'm from. And Tony, thanks for that 91 toll road. That does make a difference on Friday afternoons. Tony also worked for the Federal Highway Administration on transportation project funding, design, and environmental clearances. Tony, please come up and join us on the podium if you would. Next, we have Geoffrey Stricker. Geoffrey received his MBA from Georgetown University and is now the Managing Director of Edgemoor Infrastructure and Real Estate. Geoffrey provides executive-level leadership for the planning and execution of a portfolio of infrastructure and real estate transactions and deals, including many important P3 projects. Since joining Edgemoor, Geoffrey has been instrumental in all aspects of the development of P3 and including transportation and education projects. And for those who may not know, Edgemoor just completed one of the very first social infrastructure P3 projects in the United States, that of course being the Long Beach Courthouse project, which we discussed last year and is a topic of discussion again this year. Prior to joining Edgemoor, Geoffrey was vice president at Lehman Brothers, where he worked on research and analysis in various industries. Geoffrey, if you would, come join us. And then finally, Praful Kulkarni. Praful is a registered architect and the founder of gkkworks, which is an architectural planning and construction management firm that is specifically structured to provide customized solutions that emphasize collaborations between design professionals and construction professionals. Praful has been an active member of the Design-Build Institute of America for many years and currently serves on the DBIA National Board of Directors. He is also the chairman of the Los Angeles Economic Development Agency. Praful, if you would come join us at the podium as well. And that is our panel. And with that, I will turn the panel discussion over to Bill Eliopoulos. Bill?
Thank you, Steve. Just as a short preamble or introduction to our panel discussion, let me explain to you and give a little historical overview of why Rutan Tucker is so interested and focused on design-build. In particular, and also P3 is one element of design-build. Anybody have any idea what the ancient Egyptian pyramids, the Greek Acropolis, and the construction of the Duomo in Florence have in common in terms of construction delivery methods?
They were all design-build.
They were all design-build. That was a great guess. But, you know, we speak today of the traditional construction delivery method, not being design-build, but being design separated, then finish the design documents by an architectural and engineering team, and then putting them out to bid, and then getting the lowest competitive bidder among the contractors, and then having a separate construction phase, okay? It's this separation of powers. We speak of that as the traditional system only because it's the traditional system for modern times. But there actually was an earlier system which was called the master builder era. And I've got a slide here about the historical evolution of construction delivery. The master builder was often an architect and or engineer responsible for integrating the design and overseeing the construction of projects. And it really wasn't until starting at with the Italian Renaissance that the idea of separating the design and the build started, but it did not take hold until the Industrial Revolution. And really separating design and build into the separation of powers, design, bid, build, took hold with the Industrial Revolution in the 19th and 20th centuries, and for good reason. We're starting to then start seeing higher buildings, much more complex structures, bigger buildings, and buildings with very powerful machinery that they had to house and incorporate, not the least of which is air conditioning and heating equipment. So as a result of the inception of the Industrial Revolution, we saw this separation, this specialization of engineering and architecture and separation of that into the separation of powers from the construction. And they would kind of they would be a checkpoint toward the construction too by inspection. And this is very important in terms of building big infrastructure projects and even high-rise buildings. What we have seen now, as we believe it at Rutan Tucker, is another paradigm shift in the last 10 years or 15 years, and that is towards design-build. And I believe that this is largely because of the technological revolution. We can now communicate so much easier. The innovation is going so much faster, which I discussed last year, that you have to be able to keep up. And so the focus is on productivity and efficiency and integration and collaboration. And that is requiring us to, in the construction industry, to combine and integrate more of the design and the build. So the designers are speaking with not only the prime contractor, but involving the trade subcontractors, the key ones, in the design process. And what is even going beyond that now, as far as we see it at Rutan Tucker, and Mike started really talking about that this morning, is the P3, although P3 isn't for every project, what P3 does by, it's design build on steroids. It is integrating the design, the construction with the long-term operations and maintenance, and taking that all into account at the beginning and transferring a lot of that. We say risk, but it's really efficiency also. Transferring that efficiency to the private sector to try to do this in the most efficient way possible. And I think that's what we're seeing, and I think we're going to continue to see it. I think design build is you can see it in the statistics. It has taken over many, many projects. It's by far in the majority. And just 5, 6 years ago, it wasn't. But it has taken hold. It will continue to do that. Mike also mentioned the Humber River Hospital job as an example of innovation. We're going to have to continue that innovation and increase use of efficiencies and technology. And something like P3 is one great example of how to best take care of that. One of the things that we wanted to do is get more of a public entity perspective. And although Tony Harris is no longer with public entities in the public sector, he's moved over to the private sector. He was very involved for years in the public sector, and you still consult with the public sector quite a bit in your current capacity. So Tony, I'd like to ask you if you see strong interest among the California public agencies in pursuing P3 projects?
Bill, I would say you definitely see interest through the California agencies, and I think part of the questions you have to ask is, what are the public agencies that really see the interest? They are interested in it really because of they see it as an opportunity for another tool. And a couple points I just want to emphasize as we go through this a little bit. Why are they interested? Accelerated delivery. Now, you was talking about design-build, and I remember during my time in career at Caltrans, I was going through the battles trying to get authority to do design-build. So at first they gave me something called design sequencing. For those in the room may remember that little test part of it. And then we got to design-build. Why do we get design-build? Faster, all right? Was really the motivation behind it. And so from P3, what's the education is also begin to be talked about is what Mike was talking about earlier is better value, all right? When you talk about efficient delivery, some public agencies focus on that, some don't. I mean, it's kind of hard when you're going in and talking to a public employee who's been doing design, bid, build and say, I'm more efficient than you. There's a balancing act when you have that type of discussion and going forward. One of the most important parts of this, though, is schedule and cost certainty. All right. I've seen different slides that will show in the public sector you really focus on how much it costs for that initial construction, and I get the bid and I go award it. But a lot of times you don't get that conversation coming back talking about change orders and claims later on. That never really get aired out too much in the public, but it is kind of behind the scene. And then from the owner's perspective is the life cycle costs and assurance for operation and maintenance. There is a challenge for transportation funding overall, and there's becoming more and more attention on operation and maintenance. Cash flow and revenue are really the other big reasons why, in particular. So,
Are there particular California public agencies that you notice now that are interested in P3?
The situation you have now is Caltrans is interested, especially at the headquarters level. They do have a public-private partnership office there. I will say less so across all 12 districts. You have several districts that have an interest in it, that understand it, but I will not say it's throughout. I think you will find the larger interests. Mike was talking about there's 50 different legislations that are allowed in the United States. There are 54 regional transportation planning agencies in California alone. And I will tell you that over 20 of them have their own sales tax measures. And most of those have an interest in looking at P3s because they have resources, they have a cash flow problem. And so they have a motivation to try to figure out how to get that schedule and cost certainty to be responsive to their taxpayers. You know, so really that's where the interest is coming, is when you start talking about owners, I characterize it as you have owners and you have funders. So they see P3 as an important tool. Some of them see P3 brings new money to it. That's their big motivation, is thinking that if I can do this through P3 delivery, I'm gonna generate some revenue with it. That's the discussion to have, but that's a strong belief by others. They also see it as a way to close funding gaps. I think that's save time, cost certainty, private sector efficiency. That's how you can do some of those things. So definitely. Okay. What I see also from an owner's perspective is a lot of them really believe that there is an extensive amount of analysis and documentation that's required to select a project. Every project should not be delivered by P3. I mean, P3 is one of the tools to be in the toolbox, just like design-build, just like design-bid-build. But there is a early stage in California of trying to understand what makes a good project and how do you go about and select a project and get it through approval process in a timely manner. And then earlier I was mentioning to you about the owners. You got the entity that's got the resources and the funding, and then you got the facility owner, an operator, which in a lot of cases doesn't have the funding. So you have a natural tension there about what's important to them. What do we need to really make it successful, okay? We have legislation that sunsets in 2017, but we need to basically really early on, get a good pipeline going. If you look at information from Caltrans, there's probably about 6 projects identified as being in the pipeline. How were they identified? Well, they were identified by regional agencies that has funding. There's a couple that was identified by the unit in headquarters. I cannot name one that I believe that was identified by a local Caltrans district, all right? Because I don't believe the expertise is there for it. So when Mike was talking about this center of excellence, desperately needed, all right? We have regional agencies that have hired advisors that work directly with the regional agencies. Caltrans has a P3 unit in headquarters that consists of 4 people. And I will tell you, 2 of those 4 people are busy working on Presidio. And one of the other 2 is part-time because he has another job he's working on. So that center of excellence need resources. And it need, more opportunity to help get more projects into the pipeline. Champion, key. You need a champion that at the project level, but you also need that political champion, and those have to a lot of times be generated by education and helping to understand the benefits of the schedule, cost certainty, value add of this approach. Risk allocation. I have this debate on a daily basis about risk allocations. There are some on the public sector side that, can you really transfer risk to the private sector, or are we just kidding ourselves? Will it just come back to us? There is a risk allocation model that's out there. Decision makers and the people that are trying to work on P3s in California don't understand it or are not familiar with it. And there needs to be some education to help them understand that. And then you have the tension between the funder and the owner-operator about the risk transfer. So it's kind of behind the scene once it gets to procurement is, how's that risk on the public sector side is going to be shared between those 2 entities, all right? And that's a long debate and discussion you get into overall. The project selection approval process need to get simplified. Also, getting into procurement, there's some major issues that needs to make sure you address early on. Funders in California typically for transportation, they don't fund and pay for operation and maintenance. The owner does. So when you're putting a P3 together and it's going to be an availability approach, how are they going to split that? Make that decision early, all right? So that when you go to a procurement, it goes in a timely manner. And don't be afraid to seek input from you, the private sector, early on about your thoughts on whether it's a good project, your thoughts on what it makes sense. Don't just rely on the advisors in there and people like myself. Talk to the people that are actually going to do it early on. I just think the more you can do that, can make it better. And getting the understanding that the issue of life cycle and operation and maintenance is not just a topic for discussion when you're talking about a P3 delivery. When you do value for money analysis, one of the biggest challenges I had on a project I was working on recently is getting the owner to estimate what is their operation and maintenance costs on the other delivery models. Their information was garbage, but we're supposed to do a comparison of the different delivery methods, and so you're trying to get to something that's apples and apples. So you need to really work on that in particular. So,
Tony, just to add one thing on the risk allocation point, I think is really critical, and risk transfer and Mike can and I can, from my experience, talk about lots of projects where risk is transferred to the private sector. But the key issue is identifying which party, whether it's the public sector or the private sector, and which member of the private sector team can best price that risk. So you can give, public sector can give all the risk it wants to the private sector, but it may come at a price that makes the project too expensive. So the real key is identifying the risks in the project, coming up with a good risk matrix, and then saying which party can best price this risk and make it most efficient for the transaction.
I totally agree with you, Jeff, because this is at an early stage in California, and people are just learning how to do it on the public sector side, and there is not a good enough understanding. You either go from the viewpoint of, Jeff, I'm going to give you all the risks, all right? And then all of a sudden, as you start to think about it more, it's like, well, I can't afford that, or can I really give all that to them, or do I want to retain it? So it's the training that has to take place there in particular. So what I think you have to expect is there are several projects in the pipeline. I do believe those projects will continue to be pursued. I think the funding agencies are going to drive it more so than Caltrans will, because they have the resources. I think they have a bigger desire to drive it forward. I think Caltrans will continue to work and try to move forward. We have a sunset in the legislation coming up. I think it's critical to get that extended. The closer we get to that deadline, without it being extended, the less willingness the funding agency owners are going to be to continue to pursue these projects. And so what I really think what we can do is educate, but be specific on what we're educating about. Be very specific in educating about the schedule and cost benefit. Be very specific in educating in a little more detail about what we mean by risk transfer and having to understand exactly what that could mean. And I think there's a need to kind of help the public agencies understand what is a good P3 project and how to help them select them.
Jeff, let me ask you, Tony mentioned the importance of having a champion on the public side. And I know that's connected with taking on the private sector taking on a 30-year risk in operations. But do you have any thoughts about that and how important that is?
Sure. I mean, I think, as we've talked about, Mike mentioned, and P3s are new in the United States. They have a 10, maybe 15-year history. And so when a jurisdiction attempts a P3, for the most part, as we've seen in the projects we've pursued, it's the first time a local government or municipality or school board system has done a P3. And so, for someone on the public sector to stick their neck out becomes, in essence, critical to success. So I will talk about just briefly two projects. For UCSF, we delivered a neuroscience building under a public-private partnership last year. And in that project, the political champion was a gentleman who was a vice chancellor at the university. And the history to the project was it started originally traditional design bid build, took it to 100% drawings, bid it, came in 25% over their budget, and they canceled the project. And he said, there's got to be a better way that we can deliver infrastructure on our campus. We have limited capital, we have limited resources, there's got to be a better way. And it took him 2 years of politicking and urging, first at the university level and then at the Board of Regents level, to get them to even try a public-private partnership for a facility. The project would not have happened had this gentleman not said, I believe there's a better way for our campus to deliver better infrastructure, and therefore was willing to push and push and push to make it happen. On the Long Beach Courthouse, and I've got some updates because I know it was a topic of conversation last year, the gentleman, Clifford Ham, who's the principal architect for the courts, the project would not have happened had Clifford not said, I'm going to make this happen. He, within the AOC, going up to Sacramento, he pushed and he pushed and he pushed, and without Clifford's leadership, there would not have been the courthouse. So I think it's absolutely critical that there's a project champion on the public sector side in order to make a public-private partnership go forward.
Okay. And what trends do you see out there in terms of, for public-private partnerships, the types of
Sure.
deals that are coming
So,
out?
so I'll answer that as I go through my slides here, and largely what I'm going to talk through is 4 different trends that I see occurring in the market today, and these will largely be in the United States market, of course, and then just an update on the Long Beach Courthouse project. So the first trend that we're seeing is a shift from a payment mechanism to an availability payment, which Mike talked about earlier, and less away from revenue risk. Most of the deals that we see in the marketplace today are on the transportation side. Many of the early deals, which were either toll road deals or managed lanes deals, where it's HOV and HOT, shared users, were funded on the basis of the toll risk or taking revenue risk for the private sector. And where that has caused problems is toll roads generally on startup are unpredictable, which makes funders and rating agencies nervous, which requires greater leverage in terms of you need to collect, let's say, $2 of toll revenue for every $1 of debt versus an availability payment where it's basically $1 to $1. So it becomes much more efficient. Early deals, SR 91 that was talked about, the South Bay Expressway here in California, back east, Pocahontas Parkway. A lot of those deals, not 91, got into trouble. And there was bankruptcy or debt downgrades. That's not good for the market. The market doesn't like uncertainty, the market being the financial market. And so having an availability payment where the cash flows are predictable, as Mike talked about, they're steady, that is much more financeable. You can get better credit ratings. It makes deals eminently more financeable. The other issue is, for an availability payment, you can use it across all asset classes. There doesn't have to be a specific revenue stream like a toll collection in order for a project to go forward. So yes, it can be used for roads and transit, and we talked last night among some people, LA Metro now is a big program for P3s. The first project, used to be called the Bundle, it's now called ARTI. That's going to be an availability payment. Ohio River Bridges, which closed a couple of months ago, availability payment. The trend in the market is really on the transportation side for availability, but it works for education, it would work for social infrastructure. And then the last piece is, because the dynamics are changing, the market is becoming, as Mike mentioned earlier, more competitive. We're seeing greater influx of both international players, as well as we're seeing traditional real estate developer types, more on the social infrastructure than the transportation side, coming into the marketplace, which from a public sector perspective, right, competition is a good thing. I would caution you though, for those in the room who are contractors or developers, this is, even today, a fairly competitive market. These deals have long deal cycles. They typically take 2 to 3 years from the time an RFQ comes out till an award or maybe start of construction. They are very expensive to pursue. Mike, talked about some deals where they had $3 or $4 million at risk before they knew if they won. So it's not for the faint of heart. And the other piece, especially for the construction folks, and just as a disclaimer, Edgemoor is an affiliate and wholly owned by Clark Construction. You take on a much different risk profile than even design-build. It is really being what we call turnkey design-build. It's really being almost a developer of an asset. Not only do you have design-build risk, but you have entitlement risk, you have permits, you have utility relocation. So it's really, if you're thinking about it from a construction perspective, you're taking on a set of risks that you may or may not be comfortable with that you would typically take on. The second trend that I see, which I think is good for the industry, is the industry's presence and visibility in Washington is picking up. For years, there's been the NCPPP, National Council for Public-Private Partnerships. They're largely an advocacy group saying P3 is an alternative way of delivering projects, and they're promoting that. And that's where sort of the bright line for them stops. But we're now seeing new organizations like AI, which was founded by some of the largest U.S. and international contractors, Kiewit, Skanska, Fluor, and several others, as well as the Performance-Based Building Coalition, which is an effort largely spearheaded by AECOM, to want specific legislation passed in Congress that will help promote and unlock the public-private partnership market. Specifically on the PBBC side, they're pushing for 2 things. One, private activity bonds for social infrastructure. So the question came up earlier about financing and getting access to tax-exempt debt. Well, private activity bonds in the transportation world, in essence, give the private sector the ability to get tax-exempt financing for a private sector owner at rates basically consistent with what that municipality would get. And that's gone a long way towards helping make projects financeable. That type of legislation, other than for affordable housing, or that categorization, other than affordable housing, doesn't exist under private activity bonds, and so this group is trying to push to have social infrastructure put under that umbrella. They're also trying to get a funding or a loan program that they're calling BIFIA, modeled after TIFIA, which is used again in transportation, low interest rate loans that are patient, often subordinate to your first tier senior debt, 50 years, 40-year debt, another way to help finance projects. We're also seeing some pickup at Congress. There's been several subcommittee hearings where legislators are trying to understand public-private partnerships, the benefits, how they can help both from a construction and an O&M perspective. Several congressmen have started a caucus now to look at public-private partnerships and the benefits that it could come to the local and state governments. There's been talk, whether through the president or congressmen or some of the think tanks, about a national infrastructure bank and different ways that can be funded. So I think that's all good that all these different activities are occurring. Now, they are largely all focused on getting P3s at the local and state level. They're not predominantly focused at the state level, the federal level, and the reason is scoring. And that continues to be, in essence, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is The way CBO and OMB look at P3s is they would score it like a typical capital project. And so working with those two organizations to try and get that logjam broken, I think will be an important step for the industry.
Will you explain what you mean by scoring?
Oh, sure. And probably could be a whole separate seminar on scoring for another day. But the Congressional Budget Office, whenever there's a capital project, will look at the cost of the project and what the payments are and determine whether that project should be considered a capital lease, in essence, or an operating lease, and they follow largely the accounting rules. If it is a capital lease or it's deemed to be similar to a capital lease, then the entire cost of the project has to go into that federal agency's budget in the year that it's authorized. So rather than at a minimum saying it's a 3 or 4 year construction, spread it over 3 or 4 years. If you were to think of the life cycle of a building, spread the cost over 30 or 40 years. The way it works in Washington is if it's a $300 million project, some agency has to put $300 million in their budget in a single year. And so therefore, in times like now with tight funding, it becomes difficult to get capital projects moving at the federal level because they have to make trade-offs of what they're going to do with their money. The third piece that we're seeing is social infrastructure is beginning to gain some traction. For the last 5 or 10 years, most of the projects that have been delivered have been transportation related. The picture on the left, that's the Long Beach Courthouse, and I'll talk about it in a minute. That's a courtyard that we've built into the project. That's really the first true social infrastructure project based on, as Mike termed it earlier, the international model. The performance, both from a design-build perspective and then from a long-term operations and maintenance, are on the private sector with deductions if it had been delivered either late or operated and certain indicators in the contract are missed. But we're seeing now other municipalities look at social infrastructure projects. So in Long Beach, the government is looking at doing a city hall or a civic center as a PBI model. Down in Houston, they're looking at doing new courts and police headquarters under a triple P perspective. Multnomah Courthouse, which is the county around Portland, Oregon, same thing. UC Merced is out considering delivering over 1 million square feet of educational space under a public-private partnership. And Miami-Dade is looking at a public-private partnership to build academic and parking for their campus down in Miami. So I think it's a positive sign that we're beginning to see new jurisdictions look at it. But again, everybody on that list, it would be the first time they do a project. So hopefully, as Mike talked about, they get good advisors. They look at existing contracts so that you're not reinventing the wheel.
So let me just ask you
Sure.
a question about the Long Beach Courthouse. Now, I know a little bit about courthouses. I've spent a lot of time in them over the last 30 years. And last I recall, they're not very big revenue producers. So how did you do a P3 project when you didn't have a future revenue stream coming out of that asset?
So, and great question. So that is, as we've talked about, it is done as an availability payment. What we quoted to the court system was if our team wins, and it was a competitive process, to design, build, finance it, and it was privately financed through an equity investor and then bank financing or bank debt, and then operations and maintenance. To do that over 35 years, we'll quote you a number of X. And included in that is all the guarantees to deliver, design, build, deliver on a guaranteed price and schedule up front, with the contracting company, Clark, taking the risk to deliver. And then once the facility is delivered, Johnson Controls, who's our facility manager, has the risk to operate and maintain the building, do all the capital replacement and refresh of the building over 35 years. So I'll give you 2 quick examples. If let's just say in the contract there's indicators on what the temperature in the courtroom has to be, and it's 70 degrees plus or minus 2 degrees. If a courtroom's up to 75 degrees, that's outside the range of tolerance. A ticket goes in, it has to be fixed. They have 2 hours, 4 hours, whatever's in the contract to fix it. If it's not fixed in that time period, then they pay less money that month, the court system, to the team, and in essence make less money because we didn't solve the problem. In the unlikely scenario, the entire courthouse was unoperational for a day and they couldn't hold court anywhere, $250,000 deduction. And again the next day, and again the next day until the problem's solved. So there's tremendous incentive for the private sector to make sure that the building is always operating in a world-class manner.
So when Mike Morosco was talking about performance guarantees for P3, this is an example.
That's a perfect example. The idea with the capital replacement, and I'm sure anybody, whether they're on the public sector side or has gone and talked to the public sector, every facilities department has a stack of books that are deferred maintenance. This building, when we turn it over in 35 years, is not going to have that stack because the building is going to be maintained. And the analogy I like to use is if you think about when someone leases a car, they bring it back after 3 years, the dealership will certify pre-own the car, extend the warranty, and then resell it again, and in essence assert that the car is like new or similar to new. That's the way we're giving this building back in 35 years, and they will then have another 35 years. Yes, sir.
So quick question is the agreement down to that kind of detail, 2 degrees plus or minus,
Yep.
For across the board?
Yep.
And have there been, especially on social infrastructure, have these been in place long enough in the U.S. that there have been some controversial issues like, I don't know, I think that's 2 degrees, or that have run into some impasse that in terms of
Sure.
payment?
No is the short answer. Long Beach, as I'll talk about in a slide or two, we delivered it at the end of August, so the operating history isn't there. Mike, maybe you want to jump in because you've got history in Canada on that.
Yeah, and actually, in Australia. I mean, our longest running concession was 2004, a hospital in Australia. Those kind of performance specs are very common, and they're typically locked right into the payment mechanism. Interestingly enough, it's not that hard to actually maintain a building to those standards when you don't skimp on the first in costs and maintain the facility to the proper standard. So typically, we can respond and rectify within the prescribed periods within the contract.
Just talk real quick about transportation. That's the market that's been the hottest. 6 deals closed in the last 12 to 14 months, several other in the pipeline. As you can see on the right, lots of states, and you saw Mike's map earlier, 33 different states have it. I think what's important is a lot of the states and agencies that you see to the right have a program of projects. They're not just saying, we'll try one. Virginia publishes every year, here's a dozen projects that we want to either pursue as a public-private partnership or evaluating as a public-private partnership, and they lay out a program. LA Metro's laid out half a dozen projects. So what we're seeing really here is a pipeline of predictability of projects coming out that gives the market, the private sector, assurances that there's deal flow and that the contracts are going to be standardized and that there will be opportunities as opposed to just sort of a one-off project, which I think is important for the market. And then the last piece, just talk about real quick, is we're seeing a trend for construction companies to become sponsors. So the sponsor is the developer, the concessionaire, the lead entity for the project, the one who, in essence, manages the team through the process, puts in the bid, is awarded the project, and then has that contract for 30, 40, 50 years. What we're seeing is contractors beginning to play a role, largely in a minority perspective, not in a lead perspective, but participating in the sponsorship role along with companies like Mike's at Plenary, who's typically the lead sponsor. And that's something my company, Clark, is doing, among many others. I'm sure some of the folks in the room, their companies are probably doing that as well. Why are we doing that? A couple of reasons. One is we think there's better alignment of interests between the whole team. We think there's better transparency. Being involved in the overarching setting of the strategy for the organization we think is important. And we think it's important as well to have, in essence, what I put in quotes, a seat at the table for the conversations and the negotiations of the contract, because largely all the delivery risk get transferred down to the design-build entity, and therefore they're in the best position to want to negotiate. We, as an organization, and I won't speak for others, we purposely have a separate organization, Edgemoor, to focus on this. We invest in projects where we think it's a good investment. We don't invest to buy deals, and we don't sort of commingle. So Clark wants to build it as a builder. We want to invest as an investor. But obviously, we think organizationally and structurally, that is the right decision for our company. It is, I would say, more similar to the way the model evolved in Europe than the way it evolved in Canada. And Mike can jump in on that. But I think it's a trend that we're seeing, whether it's Kiewit, Walsh, Floor, even on the engineering side, AECOM, Parsons, the design-build entities are largely wanting to participate in some form or fashion in the sponsorship role. And then lastly, let me just talk a little bit about Long Beach, because it's, as we've said, it's really the first true social infrastructure project delivered in the United States. It's been, you know, a project of great success. I think anybody you ask, whether on the public or private sector side, has been thrilled with the project. And so just a couple of very quick slides here, and I apologize if I've been going on long. What you see here is a picture of the team from about 2 weeks ago when we had our, in essence, ceremony celebrating completion. Now we talked. Where are you, Frank? Frank was there, but I don't know if I can point him out.
Geoffrey's back there.
I'm in here, but we talked a lot about, and Mike talked about those two different projects in British Columbia at the same time. So large, 500,000 square foot courthouse, fairly complex from a systems perspective, very demanding end users, judges. We delivered the building early. We delivered it under budget, and under budget specifically to the AOC had specific allowances, but they were way under their budget. We had a full certificate of occupancy before a single occupant went in the building, which is fairly atypical. Often you'll have your temporary C of O, and then months go by and people move in, and eventually you get your final C of O. We were fully complete with that process before a single person went in the building. We talked about, and I don't know if it'll show up, but the gentleman sort of in the middle with the blue tie and the ear-to-ear grin is Clifford Ham. He's the gentleman who I mentioned was the political champion. What you can see on the right here is a quote from Clifford. I added the underlines and the italics, but I think it's telling for triple Ps. The contract and the process, the right tools and incentives for the project, they got it better than predicted, faster, and less expensive. What is the goal if you're on the public sector side? You want to deliver assets to your constituents, your taxpayers, you know, predictably, cost efficiently, on time and on budget, and this process has done that for the state.
And to fully appreciate these pictures, you have to also understand what the old courthouse looked like down in Long Beach.
Yeah, if anybody's been in the old Long Beach courthouse, it is decrepit, the elevators don't work. If you went, you know, there's videos that the court system put together. If you go in the basement and you push on the security doors, they open with no alarms going off. The judge's parking gate that's supposed to protect the judges doesn't go all the way to the ground so someone could come underneath. Water damage of files. I mean, the building's a disaster, and so this is night and day for the courthouse. These are just a couple of shots. To the left is a courtroom. To the right is that courtyard I mentioned where people can come in. You know, they're on a break, it's lunchtime, sit outside, get some fresh air, relax, nice sort of place to, especially where courts can be a stressful situation depending on why you're there, to relax and sort of be calm. On the left, one of the interesting things about the courthouse is, as I mentioned, judges are demanding clients. We spent a lot of time doing mock-ups, which I think most companies do today, to make sure we got it right so that we didn't have the change orders or I don't like this sight line to get it right. And you can see that courtroom to the left, which is replicatable across all the 31 courtrooms in the building, you know, had a lot of input from all the judges to make sure that it worked. Just a couple other slides here real quick. Front entrance. And with that, I will turn it over to Praful.
Thank you. Praful, we've talked quite a bit about the integration of design and build, and I know you've been very involved in that. And so I'm asking you from the architects and engineer side, what are the challenges and the trends as you see it in terms of integrating the designers with the builders?
Well, you know, it was good that you showed the development from the master builder to the separation of design and then bid and build, and how the trend now is back to more of a collaborative model, and certainly the technology helps. So we are in that transition period now where the architects and engineers are really trying to readjust, because the line, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, the line between the owner and the designer, be it architect or an engineer on the infrastructure side, has been strong over the last 100, 150 years, because that's a direct contract. On these design-build or P3 contracts, that relationship is changed, where either the contractor or the P3 developer is now in charge. And that's creating a lot of anxiety among professional architects and engineers. And not only is that becoming a problem, but from the owner's side, who are used to dealing directly with the designers to get the projects the way they see them, now they have to go through another layer, at least contractually. The more knowledgeable and sophisticated construction and P3 folks have figured out how to collaborate or create the model in a collaborative fashion where the owner still has direct access to the designers. But typically the contracts are not written that way. So that is an issue in terms of how that is happening. So I have very few slides, but I can kind of talk about some of these issues. And this is the question that you asked, Bill, that how, this is a model where the owner signs up with the P3 developer, then in turn, construction entity typically takes the risk, and then the architects and subcontractors as part of the team. And that dotted line is what I was talking about, is that how do we create these relationships contractually as well as informally so that we can still have that collaborative process? And that becomes a very, very important issue. And for example, the AIA has actually come out quite strongly against design-build. So because they no longer talking about having seat at the table. So as a member of the DBIA and being on the, I'm actually lead the thought leadership in design excellence for design-build. That's the other perception that the designers have, is that under design-build P3 model, design excellence cannot be achieved or not achieved very easily. So we're trying to create standards of what is design excellence, how can that be achieved in this model. As I said, since the line of communication from the owner to the designer is now dotted under this model, you still have to create standards or best practices of achieving high design. And there is some resistance coming in that area.
So just a comment, I mean, we couldn't have asked for a better example, looking at Long Beach and what a stunning building it is from a design excellence perspective. And I would argue as well that in terms of those standards, it shouldn't be the architects that set those standards, it should be the owners.
And,
right? And so, we've got a project that's just in the market in BC that came out, and it's a design school for art and design. And so they're looking for something that's out there in terms of design, right? And so as long as whatever the client asks for is what they'll get. If they don't ask for it, then they won't get it, because it's a fight to produce the lowest possible cost that meets the client's requirements.
I think that's an excellent point. I'll give you an example. What's happening with LA County. LA County, till about 5-6 years ago, were practicing the traditional design, bid, build, delivery, and constantly ran into legal problems with the low bid contractors, change orders, schedule delays, cost overruns, politically almost untenable for Department of Public Works. So they have now solved the schedule and the cost problem by going to design build. And what they are still working on is that design excellence piece. And design excellence piece has to be identified by the owner in terms of how they procure the design build services, so that there is a very definite element. And public owners and public buildings especially have a responsibility to the public to create enduring buildings. They last 50 to 100 years. It's like you're talking about the dilapidated courthouse. I mean, I'm sure when it was built, it was great, but it probably was around for a very long time, and it's lost its use in contemporary ways. So that becomes a very important piece to spell out how that project is going to be procured and what are the design standards that the owner wants in a particular project. So this I'm not covered because you talked very elegantly about life cycle costing. Needless to say, life cycle costing is a very small, the initial project cost is a very small piece compared to the overall 30 to 50 year lifespan of a building. And so that's what I was trying to say here. What I wanted to show here is that there are a lot of hybrids that are occurring on the P3 side. Slight clarification on my role at LAEDC, Los Angeles Economic Development Corporation. I'm the co-chair of the infrastructure committee, not the chair of LAEDC. May happen in the future, but not yet.
He gave you promotion.
So,
I
and this
suggest
is
you hire him as your campaign manager.
So this is a project actually that was done by LAEDC several years ago, and it was Caltrans' own land. You might be familiar with this project.
I am very much so.
Right. So,
Very much so.
and this was a unique partnership that was created. LAEDC is a 501c3, and they basically became a developer of the project. And it became a mixed-use project and took basically an asset or a land asset that was not creating any value and created this development project. And in turn, ended up making about $17 million for their cash reserves, and that became a long-term endowment. And primarily, the way the project was done was basically public agency and a 501c3 like LAEDC can come together, and it becomes a master plan development partnership. And by having a partnership with a public agency, but being the master developer as a master developer, the 501c3 can basically run the project and not have to go through the bureaucracy of the public agency in terms of their procurement standards and their inadequacies of managing these kind of projects. And so this is the model that is now being promoted to take advantage of some of the land that is owned by the County of Los Angeles and creating these developments where the 501c3 becomes a master developer, and they in turn can bring in other entities for the specific usages of these lands and projects. So mostly social infrastructure side, but and I wanted to spend, and so we are very actively looking at this, and it creates enough incentive for both the public agency as well as the 501c3 where they can benefit at the same time provide public good.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. You know, coming from, again, the court and judicial system side, you know, I know how the courts budgets have been cut, and the ability to use P3 to build a new facility that's that nice under this budget structure by leveraging the financing with the help of the private side is, I don't know how much more of striking of an endorsement you can get than that. I want to thank you all. We'll take questions offline due to the timing, but we'd be happy to answer any questions after we conclude here. Thank you very much. Very interesting.
All right, well, let me, before we all adjourn, let me just say on behalf of Rutan Tucker, we want to thank everybody for being here. This was a truly exceptional panel of experts, and they gave us outstanding information and a great presentation. So, and also thanks to all of you for being here as well. And you know, at Rutan Tucker, we like to try and make sure we stay on the leading edge of developments in the construction industry. And so these presentations are part of that program. We hope to be back again next year, and hopefully all of you will be here and more. Thank you.
6:30 is the cocktail party here.
And I'm told 6:30 is the cocktail party here.